The frozen wasteland of the Canadian Arctic trembled beneath a silence so profound it seemed the earth itself held its breath. In the endless expanse of ice and snow, where temperatures plunged to depths that could freeze blood in veins, two ancient forces prepared for a confrontation that would rewrite the laws of survival. This was not merely another territorial dispute between predators. This was the birth of a legend that would echo through the tundra for generations to come. 200 Arctic wolves, their silver coats bristling against the bitter wind, had gathered in numbers never before witnessed by human eyes. Their yellow eyes burned like flames against the white wilderness, and their howls carried across the ice like war drums announcing the arrival of an unstoppable force. Against them stood 20 polar bears, colossal titans of the north, whose massive frames cast shadows that stretched like dark omens across the frozen landscape. Each bear weighed nearly 800 pounds of pure muscle and fury, their black noses testing the air for the scent of approaching danger. The year was 2019, deep in the heart of the Arctic archipelago, where civilization had never dared to venture. Climate change had disrupted the ancient rhythms of the tundra, forcing these apex predators into a collision course that nature never intended. Melting ice had compressed their territories, driving both species toward the same dwindling resources. What began as isolated encounters soon escalated into something far more sinister. The stage was set for 5 days that would transform the Arctic into a battlefield painted with blood and ice. The wolves had not come together by chance. Led by a massive alpha known to researchers as Fenrir, these packs had abandoned their traditional boundaries to form what could only be described as an army. Fenrir stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, his scarred muzzle telling the story of countless battles survived. His pack had merged with others from across the region, driven by an instinct that whispered of impending war. The coalition stretched across the tundra like a living shadow, their movements synchronized with the precision of a military unit. The polar bears, meanwhile, had claimed the ice floes near the Beaufort Sea as their fortress. At their head stood Kodiak, a legendary male whose reputation had spread through the Arctic like wildfire. At over 9 feet tall when standing, he was a mountain of flesh and bone wrapped in thick white fur. His massive paws, each the size of dinner plates, had crushed seals with casual indifference for over 15 years. Now those same paws would be tested against an enemy unlike any he had faced before. The first tremors of conflict began 3 weeks before the main confrontation. Scout wolves had ventured too close to a polar bear den, their curiosity overwhelming their caution. The mother bear emerged like a force of nature, her roar splitting the Arctic air as she charged toward the intruders. The wolves scattered, but not before one fell beneath her massive claws. The pack returned hours later to retrieve their fallen brother, howling a mournful song that carried for miles across the ice. Word of the encounter spread through both communities like wildfire. The wolves interpreted it as an act of aggression that demanded retribution. The bears saw it as a necessary defense of their territory. Neither side understood that they were being drawn into a spiral of violence that would consume everything in its path. The Arctic itself seemed to sense the approaching storm, with aurora borealis dancing more violently across the night sky and winds howling with unusual ferocity. As the days passed, both forces began to mobilize with an intelligence that defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. The wolves established hunting parties that ranged far beyond their normal territories, testing the defenses of isolated bears. They moved in coordinated waves, their tactics evolving with each encounter. The bears responded by forming loose alliances, something unheard of among these typically solitary creatures. They began to patrol in pairs, their massive forms creating an intimidating presence that would have sent any other predator fleeing. The tension reached its breaking point when a group of young wolves stumbled upon a polar bear cub separated from its mother. The temptation proved too great, and they struck with lethal efficiency. When the mother returned to find only blood-stained ice, her anguish erupted in a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Arctic. She tracked the wolves for 3 days, her grief transforming into a rage that burned hotter than any Arctic wind. The discovery of the cub's remains sent shockwaves through the polar bear community. Kodiak himself investigated the scene, his massive head lowering to examine the evidence. The scent of wolves lingered on the ice like a declaration of war. He raised his head and released a bellow that echoed across the tundra, a sound that every creature within 50 miles recognized as a call to arms. The wolves heard that roar and understood its meaning. Fenrir gathered his lieutenants on a ridge overlooking the frozen sea, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they planned their response. The pack leaders came from territories spanning hundreds of miles, each bringing their own followers to swell the ranks. What had started as revenge for a fallen scout had evolved into something far greater. This was no longer about territory or resources. This had become a matter of dominance in the harshest environment on Earth. Both sides spent the following days in preparation. The wolves practiced coordinated attacks on imaginary enemies, their movements flowing like water over ice. They established supply lines to cached prey, understanding instinctively that the coming conflict would require sustained effort. The bears, meanwhile, began to gather at traditional meeting grounds, their usual competitive behavior giving way to an uneasy cooperation born of necessity. The Arctic landscape itself became a character in this unfolding drama. Ice formations created natural fortresses and ambush points. Frozen rivers provided highways for rapid movement. Snowdrifts offered concealment for those patient enough to wait. Both species had evolved in this environment over thousands of years, but now they would test every adaptation against an enemy equally suited for survival in these frozen wastes. Weather reports from research stations recorded unusual atmospheric disturbances in the region. Temperature fluctuations created treacherous conditions where solid ice could become deadly traps within hours. The aurora borealis painted the sky in colors that seemed to reflect the violence brewing below. Even the wildlife that normally populated the region began to flee, as if sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The final catalyst came when a hunting party of 12 wolves encountered 4 polar bears near a seal breathing hole. Neither side backed down. The wolves circled with practiced precision while the bears formed a defensive square. For 30 minutes, the two forces stared at each other across the ice, yellow eyes meeting black ones in a contest of wills that would determine the fate of the Arctic. When the first wolf lunged forward, the die was cast. The 5-day war that would become legend had begun. The frozen wasteland that had remained unchanged for millennia was about to witness a conflict that would reshape the balance of power in the north. 200 wolves against 20 bears. Intelligence against brute force. Pack tactics against individual might. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of survival itself, fought across a landscape that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The first clash erupted like thunder across the frozen plains. 4 massive polar bears, their white forms stark against the ice, faced 12 Arctic wolves whose silver coats rippled with controlled aggression. The wolves moved like liquid mercury, flowing around their opponents with precision born from countless hunts. The bears stood their ground like ancient monuments, their massive paws planted firmly on the ice as they prepared to meet the storm head-on. The lead wolf struck first, darting forward with lightning speed before retreating just beyond the reach of crushing claws. The tactic was repeated by his packmates, each wolf testing the defenses of their towering opponents. The bears swiveled their massive heads, tracking the movement with eyes that burned with primal fury. One bear lunged forward, his enormous frame moving with surprising speed, but the wolves scattered like smoke before reforming behind him. For what seemed like hours, the dance of death continued. The wolves probed for weakness while the bears conserved their strength, knowing that their endurance would determine the outcome. Blood began to stain the pristine ice as claws found their mark and teeth tore through thick fur. The sounds of battle echoed across the tundra, a symphony of snarls and roars that announced to every creature within miles that the war had truly begun. When dawn broke over the aftermath, 3 wolves lay motionless on the crimson ice, their silver coats now darkened with blood. One polar bear limped away with deep gashes across his flanks, while another nursed a torn ear that would mark him for the remainder of his days. The surviving wolves melted back into the landscape like shadows, carrying news of the first engagement to their waiting army. The bears, victorious but wounded, understood that this was merely the opening movement of a much larger symphony of violence. Word spread through both camps with the speed of Arctic wind. Fenrir received the report from his returning scouts, his yellow eyes narrowing as he processed the tactical information. The bears were formidable opponents, but they had shown vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Their size, while intimidating, also made them slower to react to coordinated attacks. The pack leader began to formulate strategies that would turn the wolves' natural advantages into weapons of war. Kodiak, meanwhile, examined the wounds of his returning warriors with the calculating gaze of a general. The wolves were more organized than he had anticipated, their attacks coordinated with a precision that spoke of intelligence beyond mere animal instinct. He understood that brute force alone would not be enough to win this conflict. The bears would need to adapt their tactics if they hoped to emerge victorious from the coming storm. The second day brought a series of skirmishes across the frozen battlefield. Small groups of wolves launched hit-and-run attacks on isolated bears, their strategy designed to wear down their opponents through constant harassment. The bears responded by tightening their formations, never allowing themselves to be caught alone on the vast expanse of ice. Each encounter left both sides bloodied but determined to continue the fight. The wolves demonstrated remarkable coordination as they adapted their hunting techniques for warfare. They established relay points across the battlefield, allowing fresh fighters to replace exhausted ones without breaking their assault patterns. Their howls carried coded messages across the tundra, coordinating movements that would have impressed military strategists. The pack structure that had evolved for hunting caribou now served as the backbone of a war machine. The polar bears, despite their solitary nature, began to exhibit cooperation that defied their evolutionary programming. They formed defensive circles around wounded comrades, their massive bodies creating impenetrable walls of fur and muscle. When wolves attempted to separate the bears from their group, the others would charge in unison, their combined weight shaking the very ground beneath their feet. The individual strength that made each bear a formidable predator was multiplied when they fought as one. Territory became the currency of war as both sides fought to control key strategic positions. Ice formations that provided elevation advantage became fortress points that changed hands multiple times throughout the day. Access to seal breathing holes took on critical importance as both species required sustenance to maintain their strength for battle. The landscape itself became a weapon as combatants used ice walls for cover and snowdrifts for concealment. By the third day, the conflict had evolved into something resembling organized warfare. The wolves had divided into specialized units, with some focusing on reconnaissance, while others served as shock troops for direct assault. Their intelligence network spanned the entire battlefield, with sentinel wolves positioned on high ground to monitor bear movements. Communication flowed seamlessly through their ranks, allowing them to respond to threats and opportunities with remarkable speed. The bears had also adapted their tactics, forming what could only be described as a phalanx formation when threatened by large wolf packs. They moved together like a living wall, their synchronized steps creating tremors that could be felt through the ice. When wolves attempted to flank them, the outer bears would wheel around to face the threat, while the inner bears maintained their forward momentum. It was a display of tactical thinking that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about polar bear behavior. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity to the unfolding conflict. Sudden blizzards would separate combatants and force temporary ceasefires as both sides sought shelter from the elements. Temperature drops that would kill unprotected humans became strategic factors as both species tested their endurance against nature's fury. The aurora borealis continued to dance overhead with unusual intensity, as if the very sky bore witness to the unprecedented violence below. Casualties mounted on both sides as the war entered its fourth day. The wolves had lost nearly 30 of their number, their smaller size making them vulnerable to the crushing power of bear attacks. However, their speed and numbers allowed them to inflict significant damage on their opponents. 5 bears now bore serious wounds that limited their mobility, while 2 others had withdrawn from active combat entirely. The arithmetic of attrition was beginning to favor the wolves, but the bear's remaining strength was concentrated and deadly. The turning point approached as both armies prepared for what many sensed would be the final confrontation. The wolves had learned to work together across pack boundaries, their cooperation transcending territorial instincts that had governed their species for millennia. The bears had forged alliances that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, their shared struggle creating bonds stronger than their solitary nature. Both sides understood that the next engagement would determine the fate of the Arctic itself. The fifth and final day dawned with an eerie stillness that seemed to mock the violence of the preceding battles. The aurora borealis had faded to a pale shimmer against the gray sky, as if even the heavens had exhausted themselves witnessing the carnage below. Across the frozen battlefield, both armies gathered their remaining strength for what every combatant understood would be the ultimate test of survival in the world's most unforgiving arena. Fenrir stood atop a windswept ridge, his battle-scarred form silhouetted against the pale morning light. Around him, the remnants of his wolf army stretched across the ice like a silver tide preparing to break upon distant shores. 170 wolves remained from the original 200, their yellow eyes reflecting a determination forged in blood and ice. Each survivor bore the marks of combat, torn ears and scarred flanks telling stories of courage under impossible odds. Yet their spirit remained unbroken, their pack bond strengthened by shared sacrifice. The Alpha's keen gaze swept across the battlefield to where his enemies had gathered near the frozen shoreline. 15 polar bears remained standing, their massive forms creating an intimidating wall of white fur and deadly intent. Kodiak dominated the center of their formation, his 9-foot frame bearing fresh wounds that only seemed to enhance his fearsome presence. The great bear's black nose tested the wind, reading the sense of approaching wolves with the wisdom of countless battles fought and won. The mathematics of war had shifted dramatically over the past 4 days. What began as overwhelming numerical superiority for the wolves had been whittled down by the brutal efficiency of polar bear combat. Yet the pack's tactical advantages remained intact, their coordination and speed still capable of overwhelming isolated opponents. The bears, though reduced in number, had concentrated power into a formation that seemed almost impregnable. Every remaining warrior on both sides understood that this final engagement would be decided not by numbers alone, but by strategy, endurance, and the will to fight beyond the point where lesser creatures would surrender. The battlefield itself bore witness to the unprecedented nature of this conflict. Crimson stains dotted the pristine snow like scattered rubies, marking locations where heroes from both sides had fallen. Ice formations had been shattered by the impact of charging bears, while wolf tracks crisscrossed the terrain in patterns that spoke of tactical movements no textbook had ever documented. The very landscape seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final chapter of this Arctic epic to unfold. Both commanders had spent the night planning their ultimate gambit. Fenrir understood that his wolves could not afford a prolonged engagement against the remaining bears. Their smaller size meant that casualties would mount quickly in direct combat, potentially leading to a catastrophic collapse of pack morale. His strategy would rely on speed, deception, and the coordinated execution of a plan that pushed wolf pack behavior to its absolute limits. The Alpha had divided his forces into 3 waves, each with a specific role in the coming assault. Kodiak's tactical thinking had evolved throughout the conflict, shaped by encounters that challenged every assumption about polar bear capabilities. He recognized that his remaining warriors represented the cream of Arctic predators, each one a veteran of multiple engagements who had proven their worth through survival. The massive bear had positioned his forces in a defensive formation that maximized their individual strengths while minimizing the wolves' ability to exploit gaps in their lines. Every bear knew their role, and every role was critical to their collective survival. The morning wind carried scents that told stories of preparation and determination. Wolf musk hung heavy in the air, mixed with the distinctive odor of polar bear fur and the metallic tang of blood that had become as familiar as the aurora itself. Both armies could smell their enemies across the frozen expanse, primitive instincts combining with learned intelligence to create a tension that seemed to vibrate through the very ice beneath their feet. As the sun reached its pale zenith in the Arctic sky, Fenrir raised his massive head and released a howl that seemed to contain the fury of every wolf that had ever run beneath northern stars. The sound rolled across the tundra like thunder, joined by the voices of his pack until the very air trembled with their combined call to battle. It was a sound that spoke of ancient wildness, of predators who had never known defeat because surrender was not written in their genetic code. Kodiak answered with a roar that seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth itself. The massive bear reared up on his hind legs, his full height casting a shadow that stretched across the ice like a dark omen. The other bears joined their voices to his, creating a chorus of dominance that had never before been heard in the Arctic. It was the sound of titans announcing their refusal to yield, regardless of the odds or the cost. The final charge began with a deception that would have impressed military strategists throughout history. The first wave of wolves advanced directly toward the bear formation, their approach telegraphed and obvious. The bears prepared to meet this frontal assault, their massive forms shifting into combat positions that had served them well throughout the war. But as the distance closed, the attacking wolves suddenly veered away, revealing their true purpose as a distraction. The second wave struck from the flanks simultaneously, their approach masked by the terrain and the focus of bear attention on the false frontal assault. 30 wolves on each side converged on the bear formation like silver lightning, their coordination perfect despite the chaos of battle. The bears wheeled to meet these new threats, their formation stretching as they struggled to maintain defensive integrity against multiple attack vectors. The silence that followed the final roar was deeper than any the Arctic had ever known. When the dust settled and the crimson snow told its tale, both armies had written their names in legend. The wolves had proven that unity could challenge even the mightiest giants, while the bears had shown that raw power, when focused, could move mountains of ice and snow. Neither side claimed victory, for victory in such a war belongs only to the frozen wasteland that witnessed it all. The 5-day Arctic War had ended not with conquest, but with respect earned through blood and courage that would echo through the tundra for generations to come.